The fluorescent light above the hospital bed made everything look slightly wrong, too bright, too clinical, too indifferent to what had just happened. Nora was sitting on the edge of a plastic chair when her mother reached across and touched her forearm, a gesture meant to soften things, to suggest that what had been done was somehow survivable in a family sense. Nora moved her arm away without a word. She watched her mother's expression shift and did not feel sorry. Maisie had been missing for 5 hours. The patrol officer had been careful with his language when he explained the situation, the way people are careful when they have terrible news and no idea how to carry it. A long-haul driver, heading south on Route 9, had spotted a child at the shoulder of the road near the junction with Old Caldwell Lane at 10:12 in the evening. The child was 6 years old, wearing a thin jacket, her sneakers gray with road dust, asking anyone who would listen for her mother by name. The officer said Maisie had been lucky. Nora remembered thinking that luck had nothing to do with it. Her sister Claudia had done this. Claudia had made a choice, and luck was not a relevant variable. The favor, as Claudia would later call it, had begun at afternoon pickup. Nora's car was in the shop. Her husband Darnell was in Phoenix for a conference. She had asked Claudia because Claudia was available, and because Nora had not yet fully absorbed the lesson that availability was not the same thing as reliability. Claudia had picked Maisie up at 3:20, which Nora knew only from the school's sign-out log, one of several documents she would later collect with the methodical focus of someone building a case, which of course she was. The story came out in pieces from Maisie first, in the fragmented syntax of a child trying to report something her vocabulary wasn't built for, and then later from Claudia herself. There had been a spill. A juice box, crimson and sticky, had rolled off the back seat and soaked into the upholstery of Claudia's car, a gray sedan, Claudia treated with the reverence some people reserve for living things. Claudia had been running late to meet someone, a man she had described to Nora twice before in terms that suggested she considered this particular relationship an event of civic importance. The spill had made her angry. The anger had made her irrational. And so she had pulled onto the gravel shoulder at the Old Caldwell Junction, explained to Maisie in what Maisie later described as her disappointed voice that Maisie would need to wait there while Claudia handled something and driven away. Maisie had waited 2 hours and 40 minutes. She had called out for a while. Then she had stopped because her throat hurt. Then she had sat down on a concrete mile marker and done something Nora had drilled into her since she was 4. She had remembered the phone number. When the driver found her, she recited it like a prayer. Nora held her daughter for a long time in that hospital room. She catalogued the weight of her, the specific exhaustion in her small body, the way Maisie's fingers knotted into Nora's shirt and refused to release. The pediatrician said she was physically fine. Then the pediatrician said, in the careful register clinicians use for things they cannot actually fix, that there might be some emotional processing ahead. Nora nodded. She already knew. She had watched Maisie flinch when a car door closed in the parking garage. She had heard her ask, 3 times in 2 hours, whether Nora was going to leave. Claudia arrived at Nora's house just past midnight. She still had her going-out clothes on. Her lipstick was slightly uneven. She stood in the doorway of Maisie's room where Nora was sitting in the dark and said, without any particular introduction, that Maisie was safe, that the road was well-traveled, that kids were adaptable. Then she said she had done the family a favor by not letting a child's tantrum derail an entire evening. Nora did not respond. She had learned early in life that Claudia required an audience and that removing the audience was the most precise tool available. The silence seemed to confuse Claudia, who filled it by expanding on her position, that Nora was overreacting, that children needed to learn that actions carried consequences, that this whole situation was being blown entirely out of proportion. Their father appeared behind Claudia in the doorway. He was still in his work clothes. He looked at Maisie sleeping and at Nora sitting beside her and said that both he and their mother understood why Claudia had made the decision she did. His voice was steady. That steadiness cost Nora something she didn't have a word for. She spent the next 4 days building documentation. Hospital records. The police report. Photographs of Maisie's feet blistered along the heels from walking on gravel in thin-soled sneakers. Notes from the pediatrician. her own journal entries, time-stamped, recording Maisie's nightmares, her new resistance to getting into cars, the way she stood very close to Nora in any room, never more than an arm's length away. She documented her parents' responses as well. Her mother's suggestion that Maisie had probably lost track of time. Her father's position that children benefit from learning to manage unexpected situations. Claudia's escalating certainty that she had done nothing wrong. She retained a family law attorney. Not to file suit, not immediately, but to establish legal standing for what came next. The attorney reviewed the documentation and did not seem surprised by any of it. The temporary restraining order was filed within the week. It prohibited Claudia from being alone with Maisie, from transporting her anywhere, from coming within a defined distance of her without Nora's explicit written consent. The judge reviewed the file thoroughly. He granted it without objection. There was something in his expression when he looked up that Nora recognized as the face of someone who had seen this kind of damage before. Then she called the state's child welfare hotline and made a report not only on Claudia, but on her parents, who had responded to their granddaughter's abandonment by defending the person responsible for it. She was not confused about what she was doing. She understood that this would be treated as a betrayal by every member of her family. She also understood that protecting Maisie from further harm required not just addressing Claudia, but addressing the environment that had told Claudia her behavior was acceptable. Her phone began ringing 90 minutes later. Her mother's voice was high and slightly unsteady, asking what Nora had done as though the answer required explanation. The investigation moved quickly. Her father's small contracting business, which ran almost entirely on community referrals, began losing clients within the month. People who had recommended him for decades quietly stopped. The CPS record, though it resulted in no charges, her parents had never directly harmed a child, became part of the public record. In a town the size of theirs, that was sufficient. Her mother, who had anchored her social life to her role as the generous stabilizing center of a large family network, found invitations thinning. The women she had known for 20 years became suddenly busy. Claudia's freelance event coordination work, which had depended entirely on word of mouth and the perception that she was a person of sound judgment, contracted sharply. A major client association declined to renew after learning of the investigation. Others followed. Nora had also spoken on the record, with a reporter writing a piece on child safety and family accountability. She had not named anyone. She had not needed to. The piece ran for several days. Everyone who knew Claudia understood exactly who had left a child on the side of Route 9. Have you ever done something you knew was right and felt no relief from it? That was the precise texture of this. There was no warmth in watching her mother become someone people stepped around at the farmer's market. There was no release in knowing that Claudia had ultimately moved to another state, in part because remaining in the same town had become untenable. Nora had not wanted any of that. What she had wanted was simpler and more fundamental. She had wanted her daughter to be safe and to know that someone had made the cost of that danger real and permanent. The restraining order became permanent when Claudia's attorney, having reviewed the full evidentiary record, advised her to accept the terms rather than contest them in front of a judge. That advice was sound. Nora knew it was sound because she had assembled everything carefully. She worked in healthcare compliance, had done so for 11 years, and the architecture of documentation. Maisie's nightmares stopped after 4 months. By spring, she was entering cars without pausing at the door. By summer, she had stopped shadowing Nora through the house. What she did not stop doing was making sure, every time they went somewhere, that she knew the plan and that the plan included coming home together. Nora considered this a reasonable adjustment for a child to make. A letter arrived from out of state about a year and a half later. Claudia's handwriting. Inside, she wrote that she was in therapy, that she had spent a significant amount of time trying to understand how she had reduced a child she claimed to love into an inconvenience she felt she could leave at the side of a road. She wrote that she did not expect forgiveness and was not asking for it as a transaction. She wrote that she was trying to become someone who would not do such a thing again. Nora read it carefully. Then she placed it in a folder alongside the hospital discharge papers and the police report, and she moved forward. Her parents never apologized. Her mother, in a letter sent the following winter that also went unanswered, wrote that she had only been trying to hold the family together. Nora thought about that framing for a long time. The family that had needed holding was the one composed of Nora and Maisie and Darnell. That family was intact. That family was fine. When Maisie was 8, she asked why Aunt Claudia didn't come around anymore. Why Grandma and Grandpa lived somewhere else now. Nora told her the truth in terms a child could hold. That Nora had protected her because Maisie mattered. That there were things people did that had real consequences, and that Nora would always choose her. Always, without exception, without negotiation. By the time Maisie was 10, she had absorbed something that Nora hoped would last her whole life. That the people who genuinely loved you were the ones who refused to treat your safety as a variable. Most people, when they imagine this kind of story, expect some version of resolution that restores what was broken. A reconciliation, a softening, a return to something resembling before. What I learned is that the restoration I was responsible for was not the family I'd grown up in, but the one I was building. And that distinction, quiet as it was, changed everything. If the people around you treated a child's safety as negotiable, what would you be willing to lose to make clear that it wasn't?